Hi, and welcome back to the Purpose Pursuit podcast with me, Hannah Miller. Today's episode is something that I know is going to resonate with loads of you. I know that because I asked you about it on socials and I got a flurry of responses really quickly. I also know it because it's something that has been part of my life, and I know that I am not alone with this. And this episode is all about dealing with mum guilt. We could call it parent guilt, but I'm a mom, so I'm coming from the mum guilt perspective. And I do think that this is something that ordinarily affects more mums than it does dads. Okay? And I want you to listen in if you are a dad, because this is going to be useful for you. And I want you to listen in if you're not a parent, because I think there's stuff in this to understand what's going on for people that you work with, people that are in your life, people that you care about. And it is a definite phenomenon that is facing mums all over the world in the current age especially. Add in being a working mum, and I think that adds a whole extra dimension to this. But I don't think this is just about being a working mum. So mum guilt for me has been something that I know I have had as like a latent emotion for the last 20 odd years. On one hand, that I'm like comfortable that I'm doing an okay job. I don't think I'm mum of the year or worst mum of the year, but I do have this feeling of whether what I'm doing or what I've done has been enough. And I've questioned that at different points of my children's lives. I think one particular thing that stands out to me that came up in a conversation with my husband a few years ago, where I said to him, you know, whenever something goes wrong, like if one of the boys has done the wrong thing, if they were cheeky, this is when they're a bit younger, in my head, there would be this narrative, which was, this is because you're a working mum. And for some reason I can't quite explain to you, I would trace everything back to decisions that I had made that meant that I felt guilty because I hadn't done enough as a mum. And Sam looked at me like, where has that come from? Because obviously he doesn't trace every time our children don't do the right thing back to the fact that he's a working dad, and yet I did. And, you know, I wanted to be with my children. I wanted to have time with them. I did not want to be working all of the time. But this is more about an overarching feeling of what I'm doing is not enough, and I feel guilty about the choices that I'm making with my time. And it's something that I would love us to reflect upon and talk about, why it's a problem and what we can do about it. So you're probably wondering, does everyone feel like this if you're listening to this? And I think the answer is a lot of people do. This mum guilt is this feeling that comes about when we have this feeling of not being good enough and wondering if we don't have what it takes to do this well. I read a great quote where it said, we expect women to work like they don't have children and to raise children like they don't work. And that's just impossible, but leads to this internal feeling of guilt, of drivenness. 70% of mothers feel guilty about taking time out. 50% feel that they don't deserve that time out. And around 1 in 3 mums agree they've never even spent a night away from their children. And another thing along with this, which I think is so true, mum guilt means that even when there's an opportunity to enjoy a break, a staggering 8 in 10 opt to do household chores such as cooking, housework or life admin rather than relaxing, believing any downtime should be used productively. And that isn't just mums, that can be much wider than that. But this feeling that I should do more is partly to do with the fact that we're on some sort of hamster wheel that is impossible for us to keep up with, but also that feeling of I'm not doing enough, which then leads to this feeling of guilt. I think having blurred boundaries can add to this feeling of guilt even more. And loads of people on social said this to me when they are dual tasking. So I think mums often do this thing where they're trying to do 2 things at once. If you're a working mum, that could be that you are quickly trying to do a couple of emails or mark a few books if you're a teacher at the same time as watching a show with your child or whatever it might be, that those kind of things happen. Or even if you're not a working parent, you're thinking, oh, I've just got this life admin to do, which I'm gonna sit here and do the banking at the same time as sitting and watching Balamori or whatever it might be for your child. And so there is a lot of this multitasking that goes on where we find ourselves trying to do two things at once. I've often got both of those tabs open in my brain, work tabs and mom tabs and life tabs. And so I'm trying to tick things off each of those. And I think that is something that leads to this feeling of guilt, because you think I'm doing none of these things as well as I could be because I'm not doing any of it as wholeheartedly as I'd like to. And when we split ourselves and we have those blurred boundaries, it's tricky. I think then when you cross a boundary, that adds to a whole load of guilt. Mom, dad, whoever you are. If you have a boundary that is, I want to do bedtime, and you've decided that's something that you want to do, and you keep missing bedtime, you are going to feel guilty about that. So there's that kind of feeling of a value that's been crossed, or a boundary that's been crossed, that feels really, really tough. I read this here and I thought it was good. The obstacles to being a volunteer at your kid's school or attending the science fair has you plotting how to sneak away from work unnoticed so that you might be able to make it just in time for your kid to look up and see you there, all the while still checking your inbox for any urgent emails. It's a no-win situation. It fuels feelings of overwhelm, exhaustion and defeat that end up leading to burnout. And that's the point here. There is an impact, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So what are some of the triggers? I think it's getting worse. I think this feeling of guilt in parenting is definitely getting worse. I think if you're listening to this and you're my generation and you ask your parents whether they had a daily thought around guilt or around whether they're doing their job well enough, I highly doubt they were. I've thought about this before. I've thought, when I'm, Sam and I are lying in bed and talking about something to do with parenting, I don't believe for £1 million that my parents ever had a conversation like that. Not because they didn't care or that they were wildly neglectful people. I just don't think they were wired in that way. So something's happened that is triggering this to feel worse. And there's a few things that I think are triggers. I think there is the way news is presented at times. There's some really nasty clickbait in some of the media and the press that paints some of the way women's expectations of mothers and of working mothers are painted, and social media presentations of perfection. There are some great accounts out there that I really enjoy that are trying to pop the bubble around this perfection. But there are some people out there that just seem to be doing it all with the perfectly turned out children who are doing everything right. And that whole vibe, which is not reality, because most people's reality has both of those things in it, can add to a trigger. I think just looking at what other mums are doing, other parents are doing, can feel like a real sense of guilt that you aren't doing what they're doing. I've watched things in the past and thought, oh my goodness, I never did things like that with my children. But you know what? That wasn't necessarily my personality to do those things with my children, and that's okay. I think the problem with all of this is that we then start to get like this purpose paralysis, because we're trying to be somebody that we're not, and not even be the personality as a parent that we are, because we're thinking, well, that's what they do with their children. They make fresh pasta from scratch, and that means that they're an amazing mom. Well, I've never made pasta with my children, and my children are okay. Also, there's nothing wrong with making fresh pasta with your children. I'm not saying that. I'm saying there is no definition of what it is. What children actually want, guys, and I can say this as I've got slightly older children, is they just want time with you. They want you to look them in the eye sometimes. They want you to be interested in what they are interested in. We don't have to do all things. Anyway, going back to triggers, I think there's family expectations as well. You have a wider family and you have what your mum did. And that can be a good thing. It can be a tricky thing, but it can also be what the expectations are around how you bring up children, how you manage being a working parent. There could be some strong values around you that you might feel a comparison with. I'm going to be honest here, like in my wider family, the other women in my generation haven't worked as much as I have. Perhaps not in quite the same sort of, in a job that's asked as much of them, especially in the early parenting years, like later on. But in the early years, I did work. I was assistant head teacher. I was part-time, but it was a consuming job. And I would sometimes look around at some of these other mums in my wider family and think, I'm the only one who's done this. And what if this doesn't work out. And all roads lead back to the fact that they're stay-at-home moms and I'm not a stay-at-home mom. And I know, again, listening to some of the responses on socials, a trigger with all of that is, my child's going to go to nursery, and what if that just means that they're on a road to ruin, or my child's going to a childminder, and we catastrophize these decisions because perhaps other people do something different and think that this is second rate, and therefore it makes us feel guilty that we're not doing the best. Then you've got culture around you as well, and the particular culture you're in. You could have actually the opposite around you, where everyone around you has pursued professional careers as mums, and you're choosing to stay at home, and you're feeling that sense of guilt in a different way, and you're thinking, well, I'm not demonstrating a life outside the home to my children, and what if that's a bad thing to do? So I can only speak from my experience, but I think it could be just as tricky the other way round as being a stay-at-home mum with working mums around you. Essentially what we're doing is we're comparing to what other people are doing and deciding that what we're doing might be something that falls short or come up short. And for many years, I'm totally honest with you, I've had that narrative go around my head of what if the decisions I've made will mean that there's impact, and I would feel guilty. And what happens when we feel guilty is we can either get stuck in a bit of a rut with it and feel like there's no way out, or we could overcompensate and go the other way and try and do super mom stuff. And most of the people I talk to more go into the overcompensating. I can remember my mum saying that to me when my children were little. Let him play. Just let him play, Hannah. He's fine on his own. Let him play. He needs to play on his own. Now, of course, it's nice to play with your children. My mum wasn't suggesting that I just left him and went and sat in the other room with a glass of wine. But what she meant was I was almost overcompensating that I'm with my child now, so I should be fully with him all the time. And if I look at mums that are younger than me, who are another generation on, because my boys are 16, 19, 21, I think this problem's getting worse. You know, this attentiveness and this desire to do everything alongside your child. You are setting a standard that you just aren't going to be able to maintain, or if you do, it's going to come at cost to yourself and other relationships like your loved one, your partner, if you have one, your friendships or other pursuits in your life. Because it becomes this all-consuming, every moment I have where I'm not working or doing X, Y, Z, I should be, alongside my child. And I think those kind of high levels of expectations on yourself, we can't meet them every day in the ins and outs of every day. And I think that's quite an unhealthy way of looking at it. I think it would be important for us to understand that this then affects how we see ourselves. It affects our image of motherhood. It affects how well we cope. It makes us feel like we're falling into this trap of being on this never-ending hamster wheel of stuff to do and never feeling like you do well enough. And I don't want to exaggerate this. I'm not exaggerating this point, because I know actually it's like a latent emotion that as you're listening to this podcast, you may have become really comfortable with, and it's just there all the time. And I'm helping you realise that it's something that you don't have to live with all of the time. Now, I'm just going to give you a few signs that you might be living with or suffering from parent guilt, from mum guilt. Okay, so here's 10 signs you might be suffering from mum guilt. You're constantly questioning your decisions. You struggle to prioritise your self-care. You feel like you never do enough. You are comparing yourself to other mums. You find yourself apologising for things. You have real difficulty enjoying any me time or hobbies. You feel judged by others. You are overcompensating in other areas. You are dwelling on any mistakes that you make, and you experience a sense of emotional burnout. You don't have to be feeling all of those, but I wonder whether some of those are resonating with you and you're like, there's 3 or 4 things on there that are an issue for me, and it's not good, and it's not helpful for me, and it's not helpful for my child. And I said, is the situation getting worse before? And I said, I really believe it is. And I was reflecting on this because, I would put my mum into like the 10 out of 10 category. I'm really fortunate to have a mum that I have a good relationship with and I love dearly. Now, obviously, I'm a grown-up and I can also see that she wasn't perfect and there were lots of things that she didn't do. And she wasn't, she worked a little bit, but my mum wasn't pursuing a professional career, but there were loads of things that she didn't do. And as I take a step back now as an adult, I'm like, did any of those things actually matter? Should we feel guilty about those things? My mum didn't even wrap stocking presents. I see that as like high level neglect. I would never not do that, but she didn't bother. She just whacked them all in a bag and went, open your stocking. Did that mean that my mum was underperforming? Did that mean that my mum should be racked with guilt on Christmas Day night that I didn't open Christmas presents? She did wrap the tree presents, just to be clear. And I'm joking here a little bit, but what I'm trying to say is there were loads of things that I didn't do with my mum, and that isn't because she wasn't present and didn't love me and wasn't fully invested in me growing up to be a healthy human being. She did the best she could with what she knew. And we know a bit more maybe now. We know a bit more about all sorts of things, but wonder whether we know too much. And I wonder whether the problem is now you are being bombarded with information about parenting and about work and about self-care and about work-life balance and about discipline and about how to help your children grow up as healthy, independent adults and helicopter parenting and gentle parenting. But all you're going to do is feel like, I don't do it. I don't meet the mark in any of these ways, and feel this sense of guilt. I feel like I was on the beginning of that growing wave of like parenting information, and I feel like now it's another level. And I don't think that does anything, if you're not careful with it, then just make you feel driven into a situation that is just untenable for everybody. Okay, so it has its impact on us, and there is something in here that is, deeply. I think if you can take a step back, we would all agree that this is not a helpful way for anybody to be living. Working mom, not working mom. If we can agree it's not a good thing, we can then begin to think about what can we do differently. And I guess I can share a bit about what's helped me. I think what I've just said already about my mum has helped me in recognising that not everything needs to be 100%. Not everything needs to be amazing to be doing a great job at parenting. And there's something to be said about consistently good being better than occasionally amazing. Being consistently good is better than occasionally amazing. One day a week where you get the flags out and you do everything, and you cook with your child and you bake with your child, and you go to the park and you do this and you do that. And then the other days you're quite removed. That's probably not as helpful as on a daily basis having connection point and being present at some point. So I think this whole idea of what does good look like consistently as opposed to occasional brilliance in the long run pays dividends as a parent. And I think we can begin to shift our perspective on this. So here's a few pointers I've got for us to consider. I think the first thing to consider is that you have limits. This is something that I'm depressingly coming back to over and over again in my life in so many different ways. I have limits, and so do you. We can grow, we can do better, we can use our time differently, we can expand, but we have limitations. And if I choose to work, it adds a limit to the way I'm going to mother. It also adds expansion. If you choose to stay at home, it will add limits to the way your life looks like, or any in between state. There are limits. And one of those limits is we have so many hours in a day. We have different capacities, we have different personalities, and we have different expectations and needs around us. All of us have different situations. Some of us have mums that help us, some of us don't. Some of us have friends that are nearby, some of us don't. Some of us have family nearby, some of us don't. Some of us work from home, some of us commute. Our situations are different, and we can look at it and recognise I have a limit. There are limits on what I can do, and then it's about choosing wisely within that limit. So what are the things that I want to choose? And I think comes with that is this understanding of your listening to your values. So my kind of second point here is, what are your values and how can you listen to those and live accordingly? Because actually, sometimes guilt is really healthy. If I have an internal value that I have made a decision, for example, that like I said before, I'm going to do bedtime 5 nights out of 7. Let's say that's like a value, a way of me living out a value of being present with my children. Obviously, I've got grown-up children now, so this is an irrelevant example, but many of you listening will be in that phase. If that's a decision you've made and you consistently only make 2 out of 7, you have crossed your values, and maybe that does cause a guilt that you need to listen to and make an adjustment. So that's perhaps a healthy sense of guilt, that you're making a decision on a regular basis that is crossing a boundary that you know you want to live by. Unhealthy guilt is unrealistic measures that have been imposed upon you around perfection. If I'm losing my rag with my son on a regular basis because I'm tired and overworked, and I have a value of trying to be reasonable in my relationship, and a healthy relationship that is not fraught with high level angst, I need to look at that and recognize actually something is causing that, and I need to make a change. So I think going back to your values and deciding what was the life you were trying to craft and what is the life you're trying to lead as a parent, recognizing limits, can help us decide whether this is helpful or unhelpful. I'm always going to say this, but we need to come back to purpose and personality, and we need to reconnect with that. I think as a parent, you need to think about the why behind what you're doing. Why are we doing the things that we're doing? What is the why that's driving what we do? And sort of see that underlying purpose in the parenting journey, in the working journey, and also alongside that, reconnecting with your personality. There are things about my personality that are really great and really good for being a mum. There are things that I do really, really well as a mum. There are other parts of my personality that are much trickier, and I need to understand the impact of those on my relationship with my children. But I need to understand that some things will just not come that easily to me. I am not going to be the mum that, like I said before, that does some sort of unbelievable craft from scratch. I've got a friend whose children have done unbelievable amounts of craft with her over the years, and she absolutely loves it. I look at the creations that they make, and I look at the stuff that they've done, and I just think, you are unbelievably amazing. I can think of 2 friends like that particularly. But I've just got to make peace with the fact that that's not what the expression of my intentional parenting looks like. It's not the story my children are going to tell, but they will say other things that I've done. And that is okay. So I think if you can come back to, like, what is it that you want to have as an overflow of your adult children's narrative, and live according to that and lean into that, you're going to do so much better. I think another thing to think about is, how do we reframe a moment? So when we're like, I feel bad that I feel bad that I've had to do X, Y, Z today. We've got to maybe think about, I made that decision because. So how do we take something that feels difficult and reframe it into, I made that decision because, and to see again that underlying purpose, that why underneath the things that you're doing. I think another really helpful point I want to make is that correlation doesn't mean causation. Let me explain what I mean. If I presented you with some data that said something like, people with grey hair are much more likely to have accidents with rowing machines, I've just totally made that up. It's so ridiculous, because if you found out that rowing machine accidents happen to more people with grey hair, it doesn't mean that they are connected pieces of data. So in the same way, when I said to you, today my child's been cheeky and that is because I was at work, that doesn't necessarily follow. Now, in the long run, if I'm never present with my children and they're acting up, there is going to be causation. There's going to be some connection there. But on any given moment, it isn't necessarily to do with a life choice I've made. I am sure my friends who are stay-at-home mums, children act up sometimes. In fact, I know they do. So there is no perfect parent and no perfect child. So what we've got to go back to again is, am I comfortable with how I'm living according to my values? And if I am, I can lean into that as my measure and yardstick. And that's okay, rather than, that's happened because of this. So there is sometimes where these things correlate, of course, as the large patterns of life, but don't look at every micro moment and think that's because I'm not doing a good enough job. You are. You're probably doing a much better job. And actually, you wouldn't be thinking like this if you were a neglectful person. People who are neglectful and don't care do not rack themselves with these thoughts. They just aren't thinking about them. So the very fact you're going through this is a really good sign that you're doing a really good job. Another point is, ask for help. Who's your village? Who are the people that you can talk to? Who are the people that will say, you don't have to think like that? Who are the people that will say, let me have them for half an hour. You go and have your hair done, or you go and sit down in a dark room for half an hour. Who are those people in your life that you can call on and be honest with? Who are the people who are going to speak truth to you when you're spiraling? Build that village of people who have walked down the road a little bit before you. You know, I can do that with some of my friends now that are having little ones, and I can share a bit of what I've experienced, and hopefully I can be a support, and I can have their baby and I can say, give them to me for a little bit, and you're doing a great job. Find the people that are going to say that to you, and find the people who will lovingly also help you when maybe something's a bit off track. I've said this already, but decide what good enough looks like. Decide what really consistently good looks like, and decide where you're going to make decisions of, do you know, this is good enough. It doesn't need to be any better. And I have decided that in advance, so I don't need to feel guilty about it. If you decide in advance that you are going to have, you're going to buy birthday cakes rather than make them because that is not your joy. If it's your joy, and I can think of some people who I know who it is their joy, but if it's not your joy and you've decided in advance, why do you need to feel guilty about that? You don't. So let it go and decide what good enough looks like for you. Jump off the comparison wheel, wagon, whatever you want to call it, that is everywhere. Make a decision to say that I am going to look at what it looks like. I'm going to look at good practice. I'm going to look at who's doing it well. I'm going to look at who's gone before me, and I'm going to glean their wisdom. But I am not going to compare myself to strangers. I'm not going to compare myself to mother and father highlights. I'm going to be realistic with where I get that comparison from. I'm going to be realistic, and I'm going to decide who are the people who are actually helpful for me to do that, who aren't going to make me feel smaller or judged. Unfollow anything that leaves you feeling a sense of wanting or guilt. Just leave it. If it's not a helpful provocation to be and do better according to your values, don't bother, because it's just not helpful. I think another question I was thinking about in preparation for today is, when I'm behaving in some way as a mum, or I'm doing some sort of activity, I'm trying to ask myself, who am I doing it for? Am I doing it because I think this is a good thing to do as a parent? Am I doing it because it feels like a good thing to do? Or am I doing it because I'm feeling a sense of pressure or expectation to do this? And lead with your personality, I've said already. Lead with your personality. Remember who you are and what you do well, and lean into that as a parent. There's actually a really good book called Strengths-Based Parenting. If you're into the whole strengths thing, which I hope you are, if you're listening to this, there's an actual book that's called Strengths-Based Parenting, which actually encourages you to lean into the strengths you have as a parent, as opposed to trying to have every strength and every talent as a parent, because you don't have them. I think my final point on this is that love covers. Like, we all fall short. We're going to fall short as parents. We're going to fall short in the workplace. We're going to fall short. But if we can really work on that underlying foundation of love, it covers so much in the long run. You can look back and with kindness to yourself and love towards yourself, and your adult child will look back with kindness and love towards you too, because that underlying motivation of love, safety, connection is so much more important than all of the rest of it. And I promise you that.